Hey everyone, welcome back to another exciting edition of the Liquid Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Karl Meisterheim. With me, as always, is the esteemed Taylor Page. Taylor, hello.
Hello, the esteemed. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's steamy.
That's.
Um, Not really, it's freezing actually. But
I was gonna
Taylor,
say where.
you own a home, right?
I do. Yeah.
So you're familiar with this idea of carrying around lots of debt. I'm assuming you have a mortgage.
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't really own the home, right? The bank does, and I pay them to stay here.
Exactly. Well, do you know there's more than just one type of debt? Have you ever considered the technical debt that you incur every time you type in a line of code, especially your
Oof.
code?
Yes, especially my code.
Well, today, Taylor, I'm excited to tell you we have a guest, Paolo Vidali. He is the founder and CEO of Hidden Gears, an e-commerce agency working on Shopify design, development, and marketing, and he's here to talk with us today about technical debt, QA, and all things Shopify development. Paulo, welcome to the show.
Much. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on here. So, for those that don't know, you are in the warm state of Hawaii at the moment. Is that correct?
I am. Yeah. I
Thanks
have
for
the
jumping on
privilege
early
of
with
living
us.
here.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's everything you think it could be at this time of year if you're not here. So, sorry.
Well, it's like 20
Everyone in
degrees
Ohio.
Fahrenheit and gloomy, like for months on end over here in Ohio. Thanks. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Here's the
Yeah.
difference between you and I, Paulo. I can get in the car and I can drive 6 hours in a straight line.
I know.
You
I do
cannot.
miss that. I do miss that. I grew up in upstate New York, so I'm well aware of the pleasures of a road trip. But yeah.
Interesting. Well, Paulo, as you know from listening to every episode, I'm sure you've listened to every episode, we usually like to kick off with what we call a little origin story, where you just kind of give us an update about how you got into development and Shopify specifically and sort of the road that led you to who you are today. So kick it off. Tell
Yeah.
us about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I got into development as a fairly young person, completely self-taught, pretty much a super nerd. I'm 42 now, so I was basically a early teenager in the 90s, and just was poking around computers. I was very privileged to have early access to the internet and the web um, through my parents who worked at the university, so kind of on the early edge of, you know, being able to have a home computer, have internet really young and so forth. So yeah, basically through sort of some light, let's call it white hat hacking and some reverse engineering and some experimentation, got involved in coding, rudimentary early web programming, etc. So I built my first website for money when I was 13, I think, for a engineering firm that was like a family friend's business, and took the photos with a 35 millimeter camera and scanned them to get them on.
Nice.
And then ended up sort of accidentally applying for an internship that I didn't realize was a college internship because high school internships aren't a thing. I had the sort of hubris to do that and got hired. And so I started working for a software company when I was 16, um, doing basically sysadmin, QA, building servers. It's kind of a B2B software company, so they had their own internal scripting language that they licensed to other software companies. So
Oh, geez.
allowing, Adobe products to talk to Microsoft products, et cetera. And eventually Microsoft sort of licensed their IP or all but bought it out. And then we were authorized Microsoft provider for Visual Basic for applications. And so we had to support basically every single version of Windows, every single version of, Linux, Debian, SGI machines, like all kinds of different systems. So it's sort of constantly maintaining, building, fixing that hardware and that software to support that company, who gave me a ton of responsibility really young. And then I decided to do like a liberal arts college education, didn't really want to get locked into tech. And so I've sort of wove in and out of tech as a self-taught person, um, sort of pursuing what I wanted to academically, which typically wasn't anything on the sort of engineering or comp sci kind of side of things. And then eventually, started working for another software and hardware company. And then those folks had a bunch of different brands, um, had 5 different e-commerce stores in, like, let's say the mid-aughts, and said, hey, our e-commerce person just left. Can you do this? I'm like, well, I'm a full-time QA tester, but I do have some web experience, and then sort of from there kind of got, again, thrown in the mix, given a lot of trust and responsibility, and just figured it out. So
Yeah.
in that process, they were on a whole bunch of kind of strange, antiquated e-com platforms, including NetSuite, and I think they had a Yahoo store at one point, all kinds of
Nice.
things that don't exist anymore. And it's like, this doesn't make any sense. This is costing you a crazy amount of money, and it's so inflexible. It takes so long to build things, to jump through these hoops to, get them pushed, and essentially moved them to Shopify in 2009. Back when Shopify was a pretty tiny company. I think there's maybe 12 employees at the time or something like that. So I would, post things to the support forum, which is basically the only way you got support. And, I'd see something come in at, 11 p.m. from Toby being like, fixing this right away, And,
Wow, that's legit.
it was just kind of a little bit Wild West. And those were the days when also you could do anything and checkout.liquid existed, and then they took it away, and then they brought it back for Plus. So remember that kind of trajectory of like, oh man, all my customizations are getting wiped out because we can't do that anymore, and things of that nature. So yeah, and then eventually worked for a digital marketing agency, got sort of back into the marketing world, where I had some experience before, and I think if there's a common thread, it's just being really sort of data driven and really enjoying experimentation and just figuring things out and enjoying that process of always learning and always tinkering. And obviously everything changes so fast, you sort of have to keep up with it. If you don't like that, you're not going to like developing for the web. So and so I've had this agency I founded in 2012, kind of as side work, because I was working for an agency that didn't do any e-com, and I really liked doing that. And then 10 years ago, sort of struck out full time, and building, slowly a sort of boutique small team, or about 6 full time and 3 contract, doing Shopify design and dev. So, that's really been our focus for quite some time.
In your experience with e-commerce, have you always been Shopify exclusive, or have you mucked around with some of the other ones?
Yeah, in early days, we definitely did a little bit of everything. I used to call myself platform agnostic. We did some Magento, we did some BigCommerce, we did some custom carts, we did a bunch of WordPress sites, mostly those that sort of acted like e-commerce stores but didn't actually have e-commerce functionality, like essentially cataloging for folks that were maybe B2B and they wanted a huge product database, but then in the end, they didn't sell it online, things of that nature. And decided to go do 2 things in January 2020, which was fortuitous, which was one, take the company remote. So we actually had an office in New York and trying to build a team locally at the time, and to focus exclusively on Shopify. And that turned out to be good timing, and haven't really looked back since then.
That's a cool story.
Oh,
yeah. You said you went to college, a liberal arts college, and were kind of moving away from technology. What was your major?
So I was a political studies and Latin American studies major at Bard College, which is about 2 hours north of New York City. And then I also have a master's in environmental studies, specifically in sustainable biofuels, from Prescott College in Arizona. So at a certain point, I was looking to move from sort of tech to green tech. And it was just unfortunate that my timing of graduation from my master's program was exactly when all of the Obama era tax credits dried up, and everyone's like, I can hire you if, Congress passes this bill, and then they wouldn't, It's like, all right, I'm going back to code, But I don't regret it. I really like the process of having the discipline to just like learn new stuff that, interested in. So
Yeah. You mentioned marketing and development. Which one do you tend to find yourself enjoying more?
that's a good question. I think for me, it's at this point in my career and being an agency owner, I feel like marketing is what I enjoy because code can still stress me out a lot. So at this point, I'm, kind of like doing code review and so forth, but I'm not really in the trenches, trying to make stuff work. And greatly appreciate the team that helps support me do that. But I'm still doing a lot of marketing consultation or things that are, kind of on a high level of using an analytical mind, but, you know, generating a report rather than generating, a web app or something. So, but I don't know, there is something to be said. It's hard. I think it's hard to hang up your hat on being a developer. I think that it's still something I will do for fun, sort of in perpetuity. And something that also I get to do, maybe the fun part, which is, experimenting with all these different new apps or integrations and sort of then saying, okay, this is our strategy as a company, or like, let's start using this, or, that part. But yeah, I think, and I've done both almost the same length of time, and so I can't really say. It's just for the marketing I do, I definitely am a data-driven person, in that it's really about like analyzing, pattern matching, finding interesting things from the information to then act on. And I always tell folks it's like ironic that the one, sort of class that I did take or education I did have that really affected my daily life, in my career the most was I took AP Stats to get out of taking AP Calc. And as a complete like throwaway, like I can't deal with calculus, like let me just do something. I have to fulfill my requirement in high school. And then I'm using statistical analysis like every single day, all the time, forever.
Cool.
So it's kind of funny.
College math for the win. Um, so I would be interested in diving right into the QA stuff. Taylor, do you have any functory questions before we do that?
No, just I mean, just want to point out. I mean, are you, Carl, are you the least educated person on this call now? Like,
Look,
I don't remember your master's degree. That's the two guys with completely unrelated master's degrees to their fields on the
I was
call.
about to finish and one exam left, and then I had to go to Unite 2019, so I couldn't sit for the
How
exam.
did you bring that back around? That is just that is brutal. No,
But
see, look at that. I tried my jab, and you just got me right back, man. Like, well done.
No, I do not
I'm
have a
even mad
master's
about that.
degree. Sorry. God gracious.
No, I think it's pretty amazing to hear about how things came full circle there. So is that kind of, I know you mentioned that was like the hope. I mean, ideally is, kind of like this idea of sustainability and, and all this other stuff. Is that something you're like working towards eventually, or something you're hoping you can start to fold in eventually with the agency as well, or just kind of, maybe someday kind of type thing?
I think in terms of my professional life, it's more in the maybe someday category. I think we're definitely, interested in helping our clients find sustainable solutions to things like, we help them with logistics and 3PLs and fulfillment, and e-commerce. And like we did a project where in part of a design that would go on to packaging, like a poly bag where you'd get clothing in it, like we were able to say, oh, actually there's this compostable one, why don't we try that, and we can market it like this, and like that would really make an impact. So I think there's small ways we get involved in, although we're not packaging designers or people who are actually responsible directly for making obviously the products that our clients sell. A lot of our clients are designing and making the goods they sell. And so in part of that conversation, again, particularly about marketing, it's like, well, what is your take on sustainability, or how are you going to message this, or this is something people are searching for, here's the volume on that, maybe is there a way you could incorporate that into some aspect of materiality or the sourcing or the production, etc. Personally, I made biodiesel for 6 years and ran my car on it and drove cross country and back a bunch of times, and sort of helped start a local co-op and did a lot of like kind of grassroots stuff in that realm. So I think I was able to have that fulfillment, at least personally, although
Wow.
it didn't quite turn into a career. That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate it, and I like talking to people who also have unrelated like degrees and specific things to see. How are you using this now? So that's really
right.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty extreme. When you first said I made biodiesel, I was thinking, oh, like at a job somewhere. And then I think maybe you made it like in your basement or something. That's pretty hardcore.
Yeah, in my friend's garage, and then later in this kind of like community center space, we built a shed and then built everything in the shed. It's basically also something I did not think I would use was, like chemistry in a real practical sense of like doing titrations and like mixing up lye and methanol and putting that with waste vegetable oil and, knocking on the back door of restaurants and using pumps and, to transfer large amounts of fluids into a pickup truck. So they're laden with, giant IBC totes of things sloshing around. So it was definitely quite the experience.
You're kind of
But it's
like
something that's actually you can do in your backyard technically if you have the room. So yeah,
your career sounds a little bit like Shopify developer plus Beautiful Mind plus Breaking Bad. It's a quite the trajectory you've been on.
I never made it to the end of Breaking Bad, but I'll take that as a compliment.
Well, uh, anyway, so you mentioned to me when we were first talking about getting on here that you knew some things about QA, and I'm very curious
Yeah,
because all my clients are listening. Don't take this the wrong way, but QA is not necessarily a huge part of the process that I typically go through. Obviously, we make sure it works before we ship it, but there's a lot more to it than that. I know from other
yeah.
contexts. I'm curious as an agency owner how you approach it. But before we jump in, could you give me some context around like when you say QA, what sort of work are you QAing? Is it a little bit of theme modification? Are we talking about functions, talking about full-blown apps? Like, what
And
has
if we
been your
want
experience?
to define QA for those of us who might not be as familiar,
Yeah,
I thought you had a
just give
master's
us.
degree.
Well, I'm talking for the other listeners, Carl. Okay, that's
yeah. So quality assurance is a I like to think of it as a philosophy more than a task, but in essence, it's the process of trying to run through all the different scenarios in which you've built something to make sure that it actually works and supports what it's supposed to support and doesn't break when it's not supposed to break. So coming from my initial background being in the software world, um, in software for folks who don't develop software, and I think a lot of folks on web haven't necessarily gone in the software realm. So I'll just say in the software world, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make an app or a piece of software that is performing all these different specific functions, but you also have to anticipate like what are all the things that people might do with this that might not be the intended uses, map out all those use cases, and then figure out how to write essentially exceptions to all of those that says, well, if you click on this 27 times, it's not supposed to crash, but what if someone clicks on it 27 times, or if someone tries combining this object and this object and then goes to this other thing, where does that go? What is supposed to happen? Are we supposed to throw an error message? What does the error message say? How should that be cancelable? Where do they return to the state after that? And you kind of have to brainstorm and map out all the different ways, not only that someone should use or could use the software, but also where they might get stuck along the way, or where it might just fail along the way. And then you have to map all of those out as well. And so then moving that kind of idea to the web, it's really, yeah, for us, it's we do custom theme design development. We also do a lot of mods and iterative features. We do, I would say, like essentially rescue projects where we're taking over a theme that was built by another team, kind of reverse engineering that, figuring out what all the pain points were, which is maybe why someone switched agencies or why someone came to us saying, like, we need to figure out this just doesn't work, or this never worked as intended, or our customer service team is telling us every day that X, Y, and Z is happening, right? And then So it's queuing our own work. It's maybe queuing a project that's coming in. And then, yeah, it could also be right now, we're doing things with functions and flow and, checkout extensibility and things like that. So it's moving more into sort of the app and software realm a bit too. And then also in terms of vetting process, folks come to us as a trusted partner and they say, what reviews app should I use? What X solution, if we're not going to build it from scratch or there's a budget concern or it's just, some app company has made something that solves a lot of problems. It looks great, but it's $2 a month. Like, can I trust that? Or it looks great, but it's $2,000 a month. Is it worth that? And so we'll actually essentially do our own vetting QA process on external services and so forth to avoid having dependencies that fail, which is certainly, I think, if there is an Achilles heel for Shopify, it's that, you can add a ton of apps and they might be pinging servers in Australia and Europe and Canada and all over the world. And if one of those goes down, you're going to lose that feature, or worse, the site might break. So we're always pretty minimal about how we do integrations and stuff like that. But yeah, for us then, as what we're actually doing to QA as part of our process, I would split it into, design QA and let's call it like features or dev QA. Believe it or not, designers are the best at doing design QA, and they will give completely different feedback than if you have 5 devs look at a site and look at a Figma and look at the front end and say, yep, this looks good. And then you have one designer look and be like, this is off, this is off, this is off, right? So, because I think there's a certain myopia we have as developers, where we're like, this seems to do everything, this seems to be great. And in reality, it's really hard to have that without the sort of design sensibility too.
So just to clarify, design QA to you is a designer looking at the design before implementation or coming back after implementation and vetting that it meets their expectations?
After implementation, well, presumably pre-production, essentially an internal beta or, something in progress, or we think this is all ready and buttoned up to share with the client, and having the original designer review it, or in some cases, if you have a big team, there might be a senior designer or a different design lead or something reviewing it, because there can be a lot of subtle differences, like the way a font renders on the web is different from how it renders in a design typically, and whether you're looking at Firefox or you're looking at Chrome, could be thicker, kind of heavier, could be slightly different scaling, could have these different attributes, which could say, actually, yeah, you did code this and use this font at this, 200 weight, but actually the way this is rendering the front end is not going to work. We actually need to change that to 100 or something.
To get that level of specificity then, when you guys scope out a project, do you pass like just a simple wireframe off to your developers, or do you have like a full blown out Figma mockup or something to that equivalent?
For something that is large enough to be its own kind of project, I would say, whether that's an iterative feature or a site or a full page, we would have high fidelity comps.
Gotcha.
And then for things that might be, hey, we want to iterate off of this and kind of riff on it, it needs to be roughly the same, but we're like changing these aspects of it technically and adding a field maybe to some form. We're not going to do a full comp necessarily. It's going to be inherit the styles that exist in the standards that exist. So yeah, in that case, you don't really have a design QA other than if there's something that pops up, like we had something where it's like, well, this, contact form has only had text fields, and then we added a drop down, and that looks weird. And now we're gonna, check in with the designer and make sure that that is going to be congruent with the rest of the site, even though that element hasn't existed and so on. But yeah,
it's nice that you have all that in house, because I think, like you said, a programmer and a designer certainly have a different perspective. I know even in my own work, I've been guilty sometimes of working really hard on a feature, saying it's finished, passing it back up to my client, realizing I never actually looked at the mobile version of it because I was just so fixated on, developing in the desktop version, and all kinds of things would break. Like, oh crap. So
Yeah,
it's nice you can cover each other that way.
for sure. I think it's always good to know, what the client is using. Not that you should only make it look good for that, but there's certainly cases where it's like, I'm on my 27-inch iMac and this looks like this. And it's like, well, yeah, it's this wide and has this pixel density, so it's going to be wider, or this might scale, but also knowing that and just sort of giving it a pass, I think is a good trick. We also use, browser stack to get actual devices, so it's like we're not simulating the width of, an iPhone 16. We're actually looking at it within a, remote controlled virtualized iPhone 16 environment, etc. And yeah, definitely having a standards list of the browsers, devices, and level of versions you're going to support. So for us, we say, we'll go 3 versions back of whatever the current build is of, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, whatever. And we'll support X amount of different browsers and operating systems, and, check on at least X devices, which includes iPad and a Galaxy phone and all these different things, because the reality is, if we go into the analytics of any client, I mean, it's statistically probable that there will be someone out there with a different device than you have. And then if you look at an aggregate over a month or 6 months or a year, you're like, wow, that's thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, right? We're looking at this. And so my personal philosophy is that I don't really believe in automation for QA, and maybe that's because I was, a full-time QA tester, and I think automation for software QA, where you have so many different scenarios, you need to run some sort of UAT process to do that. But for the web, for me, automation can just greenlight stuff that's not actually functionally, usable, and that also goes for accessibility. So we do a lot of ADA testing as well as part of QA, which is like, well, okay, this looks okay and passes this software test that says this is good, but then if you're actually using the keyboard and tab and trying to navigate through these elements, you can't actually get there.
So
Right? So
stop for a second there and talk to us more about the ADA testing, because I know we've had a guest on not too long ago where we talked about this extensively. Sounds like if you guys are testing for it in your QA process, that you've also, from the moment you started development, kept that in mind and have your developers
mhm.
keeping those things in place. Is that true?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it really starts in design, because you have color contrast, you have certain padding zones, because, if your buttons are too small, you're not going to be able to actually tap on them versus click on them, how images are handled, etc. But then also in the build process, for sure, making sure alt text is wired up, making sure the content team, or if it's our sort of digital production team, whoever's putting in images, all of those are tagged appropriately. And then there's a lot of nuance, and dozens if not hundreds of pages of sort of general rules in which the site should perform and function in a certain way. Means also actually licensing accessibility software like screen reader software, so you can output reports of or use it in a screen reader mode where it's actually saying things, speaking the text of the site out loud as you navigate through it. And that's a whole other depth of QA that, has sort of come around in the last, let's call it, maybe 6 or 7 years, as accessibility for the web became better defined. And yeah, it's made it much more complex. It's a whole other layer, because it's, again, if you're doing design QA, it's all seen. If you're doing accessibility, it's all essentially unseen. And you really have to bake in those best practices early. Otherwise, it's kind of a quagmire to try to fix it later. So you're like, oh, now I have to restructure this div that was nested in this thing that blocks it, and then that breaks the design, and that has to do, and you could spend hours on a single thing, right? If you haven't sort of at least lightly anticipated for it and saying, okay, we're gonna keep this clean in a certain way, or we're gonna check in and see how this is done before we actually do it and build something complicated that doesn't actually function in that manner.
That's really cool. When you talk about licensing accessibility software, is there a particular package you have found to be most helpful?
Um, there are a good suite of free Chrome tools that will get you like fairly far. Um, there's one that's called, let me pull up my extension list and I will tell you. ARIA DevTools is a new one that actually will output basically in console an entire kind of sheet of all the text and all the ways that's perceived. And if you start using it with a keyboard and submit an email form, it will return the response the screen reader will get, things like that. Browser Stack has an accessibility toolkit. It is an add-on to their service. There's definitely some cool features there. DeQ University has an accessibility conference. Actually, I think that their virtual conference is coming up at the end of the month and it's free. And Wave, which is put out by WebAIM, which is on the standards board, WCAG, WCAG, the actual organization that makes the sort of web standards. And then TPGI Software is the company that makes JAWS, which is one of the most popular screen readers, and they have a tool called JAWS Inspect, and that again lets you create these reports that are outputting everything that a screen reader sort of sees on the behalf of the person, how they output it. So you can say, oh, I thought this button said shop now, but it's actually outputting as button ID 5 or something for some reason. Like, why is that? Oh, there's a typo in this, and that's throwing off that, and that kind of thing. So it does add up. I think for us, it's just a cost of doing business, just to run through what we're able to do for folks, and not that we, can certify anything or guarantee anything, but we certainly want to give it our best effort and say, like, as far as we can tell, not being disability advocates or not being folks that are really in need necessarily of accessibility per se, we still are doing our best to make sure that what we're building can be used by everyone. And I do think that ultimately it creates, in a sense, less complicated designs, or it's forcing designers, developers to distill things into, just to like cleaner builds essentially.
Sure.
You cannot be too overwrought and have it still function on a certain level, I think, without jumping through a lot of hoops, which isn't necessarily worth it. So.
Now, Taylor, I'm interested in talking a bit more about QA on the back end, but before I redirect the conversation, do you have anything on the front end? Because I know you love the front end.
I mean I do. That's where I live. So, but no, I think a lot of that makes a ton of sense. I think there's a big benefit, and probably a benefit of like being an agency, being in a position like as a solo dev. Like I have found it super helpful to be able to hand off something that I'm like, hey, this works great. And so my wife works with me on some projects now, and she does a lot of UX work, and so it's actually I had to get over handing that off to someone and she'd been like, yeah, this is why would you do it this way? This is dumb. And I'm like, no, this works exactly. And because you get into this mindset of as a developer who's building it, right? Like this is how everyone's going to use it. And then someone who's non-technical comes in and uses it the exact opposite way. So having both sets of people in there is fantastic so when we're talking about like quality assurance or QA process, having something like that is really helpful. And then I'm very glad that y'all do a lot from the accessibility standpoint as well, because that's pretty huge for people to be informed there. So no questions. I think that's aces across the board there for the front end stuff.
Awesome. Paulo, you mentioned in your outline something called diligence and destruction, and you don't know if you touched on it already, but I'm not familiar with that term. What does that mean? And I'd love for you to jump into the code QA and talk about how you do that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I I guess the phrase just popped into my head as I was writing out our kind of outline. So for me, it means, I think, well, for I think some folks, QA testing means, oh, you try to break it, or you poke around, you do a bunch of random clicking, and you see what happens. For me, that diligence and destruction is putting yourself in the mind of a user, particularly maybe one who's not adept or one who's just gonna um, try everything or yeah, be destructive in a certain way and really hammer on things and really try to break stuff. So, like I mentioned, the 27 clicks, or I work for a hardware company and they had a audio player, and we were getting these reports from users that the player would just stop after, and this is for audiobooks and sort of right before iPhone blew up. So we were getting reports from users that their players would just crash basically and die, but it was only after being used for like several hours, and we're like, what could be causing it? There's no overheating. We can't figure out any way in which this would be happening. We've gone through and QA'd, and from a electronics perspective, all these different boards, 20,000 boards. There's no reason it's happening. And we finally figured out that it was people who are playing audiobooks that had incredibly short chapters. And so if you went to something like 250 chapters, that there would be this memory error and it would crash. Or if you clicked on it 250 times to advance, you could get it to crash in about 30 seconds. And it was actually because of a solder misconfiguration where something was over soldered and it bridged, one of the pins on the chips, and that reduced its actual usable memory by, like 80%. Well, how did I find this out? It was like, well, I had to click on stuff 250 times. I clicked on it 100 times. I clicked on it, I clicked back and forth, up, down, whatever. If you have a controller, for a video game, it's a similar thing. It's like, how do you get something to crash? Well, you can't just randomly do it, because in QA it has to be reproducible. The bug doesn't exist essentially unless you can reproduce it.
Yeah.
You might be able to get it happen once, but you can say it's a fluke. It's a bad solar flare day. There was, static electricity that I picked up on the carpet and something happened. There's maybe some actual reasons why something could crash or something weird might happen. There's when your Chrome extensions went wild and you didn't realize you're out of memory. It's not actually necessarily the thing that you're trying to test fault, unless you can say, every time I do this in this sequence, in this pattern, this happens. And then you're able to document that, and then you're able to explain that, and then you're able to work with the engineer, dev, or whoever to fix that. So for me, it's just underscoring the point of really being very methodical in how you're going about QA, because there can be very complex sequences of events that can lead to catastrophic things or bizarre things. But you have to remember where you are on the path. You have to chart that path, and you have to sort of be creative in terms of like, okay, I did this way, now I'm going to do this variation, now I'm going to do this variation, I'm going to do this variation. And you have to, in trying to make something fail, you have to be very, very precise, which I think a lot of people think is like, I'm just going to click around and try to fill up the memory, and then it'll crash, and then we'll have a report, which is just not actually going to be helpful. So
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for enlightening us on that. Now, I know I talked about wanting to talk about QA and the code level, and I do, but I'm also noticing where we're at with time, and I want to make sure we get to the technical debt portion, because I think that's going to be fascinating. Yeah. And I also hinted at it at the beginning of the episode. So be a man of my word. Can we shift gears and talk a little bit more about that? And when you talk about technical debt, are you talking about the debt that has occurred as you guys do your own in-house development, or are you talking specifically about debt that you inherit from projects that come your way?
I mean, it's really both. I think if you're not careful, you could, trash talk someone else's technical debt while creating your own, right? So I think it goes both ways. I think it's most obvious when it's not your own because you don't have that. It's much harder to have an editorial perspective, right, when it's something that you wrote. Whereas you're looking at someone else's work and you're like, oh man, like look at this, look at this. It just all kind of pops out much easier. But yeah, I think, being a very technically driven person and sort of making some of my reputation on the ability to figure out weird and complex things and sort of having this background in QA and software and whatever, we have had the opportunity to take over various projects that were built from much larger, fancier agencies that just never quite worked right, or looked beautiful but didn't actually fulfill the brief in terms of technical requirements. And we've taken people out of like headless, for instance, where it's like there's just so much technical debt in a project that was built by a team of really cool engineers who are really smart, but they were maybe chasing the shiny object syndrome, right? Where they're like, oh, let's build this with this new database, or let's build this with, this new technology because it's cool and fun, and it might actually, fulfill, in theory, all the front end requirements. But then you have to do a 12-step deploy every time they change content on the site.
Without calling anyone by name, can you give us a specific example of something like that?
Yeah, so we had a client that had a site that was built, essentially they were on Shopify, regular sort of theme. They said, this feels templatey, this feels kind of generic, this isn't, befitting of our brand. Had an agency redesign it, and in the process, they built it with Contentful, and they built it with some sort of custom web app stuff that was going on. So you had a private app that needed to be maintained. You had the taxonomy and everything that was going on Contentful, and then they built it by having I don't even remember the name of the company, but there was a company that went out of business, which is also part of it. And they were going out of business, but before they went out of business, they doubled their prices. That would, claim to sort of do automated deploys, so detect contentful changes, and then build, the site and then deploy it automatically. And it just never really worked. And so basically, we had to go through that app, but then I think refresh Heroku in a certain way, and then also clear cache, and then we were just jumping through literally a dozen hoops to get this site to work. I was like, this is so brittle. Like, this is dangerous. Like, if you don't have someone who does these things in the right order, like, we'll spend 2 hours on it instead of 10 minutes. And the actual stack that it was on, like, as I mentioned, the company I think went under. It was a startup, so it's like, well, we have to re-engineer the deployment process anyway, not only because it's terrible, but because like this whole thing is being sundown because it was built on something that was very early, right? And then ended up kind of rewriting the private app into a web-packed kind of like mini web app that was not maybe as configurable, but was way more stable and didn't have any other external dependencies, and then essentially rethemed and got rid of the headless aspect. So I think that the reason that happened really was because at the time that site was built on headless, the client was told a bunch of things but didn't actually understand what it meant, like functionally. I think they were like, this is your site, it's going to be amazing, it's going to do all this different stuff, it's going to be great, you're going to have all this flexibility in this cool CMS, which is better than Shopify CMS. And then they didn't say, but you'll basically have to hire us, like every day forever if you're managing your site on a daily basis. Then that agency also went out of business, so it was like
Oof.
dependencies on dependencies and contingencies on contingencies. So yeah,
That's brutal.
I think that's something we've been down that road where it's like, if if you really want to go the full stack custom buzzword route, let's say to get site speed or to get certain features or whatever, you really have to understand what it means in terms of, hey, do you have a in-house development team? Do you,
Yeah.
have a certain block of, standing time with a developer? Do you have a, freelance dev like yourselves who are going to be able to actually be very readily available to push things or to, be able to modify things to suit that? Or do you really want to own a site and take it and run with it? And for us, our philosophy is we tell folks we always give you the keys and we always give you the training so that if you want to DIY and self-manage everything, you can, and we're here if you don't. But like in theory, like if you have the time and the inclination, you should be able to pretty much do everything with your own site, because otherwise, I think, it can just get into a sort of sticky situation with not actually having control over the sort of product you built.
Yeah, that's not good. I feel like, I don't know about you, Taylor. When I heard about headless, it seemed really cool. Like, oh, something I might want to play around with. Never got around to it. And now, anytime I hear about headless, it's usually in the context of how it didn't work out. I'm sure there are many companies out there that are using it successfully, but I feel like a lot of folks get caught by not fully
Yeah.
understanding the
It's that
implication.
shiny object syndrome, and like I don't know, like as a developer, like you feel like this feels more developer-y. Like one of the reasons I
Yeah.
thought I couldn't get jobs on Shopify early on was like no one's going to need help building Shopify shops. This is too easy to work with in some instances, right? And so, but then you
Yeah.
find out there's actually a lot that you can do with it. So I don't know. Most people, I think headless makes sense in a lot fewer use cases than a lot of people like to think. I know there are some shops that's all they do is headless, and that's
Yeah.
great. But I think, like you had mentioned, I think too, Paolo, is just if you have like the technical team and support to like maintain it, that's great. But for people that don't have that and don't want to opt into that, they can't really expect to just not have all these technical processes involved if you're going headless. We're just not there yet.
Yeah. I think there's also maybe like SaaS layers like Vercel or others that are really expensive, but sort of grease the wheels and do the stuff that, you might need a team to do in that sense of like making sure that something's readily deployable or just more easily managed, but it comes certainly at a cost. Um, so yeah, and I think, actually in the sort of earlier days, I would have trouble hiring devs, um, because basically got written off as like, um, it got written off, I think, as a platform that like wasn't, hardcore enough for devs. It's like, oh, what stack? Oh, you're in Shopify as managed hosting. Like that's not real, or you can't do anything, or like, of course, I had, people applying to jobs who are like, I don't have any Shopify experience, but it's easy, so I can certainly do it. And you're like, no, you misunderstand the problem. It's like there's actually a lot you can get into. For me, the reason to really stick with something that's managed is because I came from IT. Like, I don't want to be on a beeper at 3 a.m. Like if something goes down, it's really Shopify's problem or the app's problem. And also, as long as we've had really good QA processes where it's like there's no surprises or there's rarely any surprises. But yeah, once you go to something like headless, then you remove all the benefits of managed, right? And you're back to bare metal, and you're like, yeah, if something goes down, like someone has to get up and fix it. Otherwise, you're just not making sales for X amount of time, and that kind of uh, responsibility is, I think, not necessarily understood before those kind of things get built.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you touched on, again, going back to your outline, is
Mhm.
this something called inside out retheming as far as dealing with technical debt. So walk us through
Cool.
some of that. What do you mean by inside out retheming, and how have you done this in practice? Because I think that'd be
Yeah,
really interesting.
I found so for a lot of projects that we take on that are equivalent to rescue projects or the sort of theme takeover projects, um, in my experience, the client is fairly traumatized by the previous site build experience and does not want to go through another 3 to 6 month process of, custom design and then being told all this stuff's going to work and then the deadline being missed and then whatever has happened. Don't want to do it again. but they also sort of want a new site / one that functions in a completely different way or in a way that requires like a substantial amount of development to get to that point. And so for me, that's what I've found we've kind of come to is essentially rebuilding and this could just be in the back end, but it could also be, with front end changes as well, of course, rebuilding themes without actually throwing everything out and clean slating because the budget's not there, the timeline's not there, and just the appetite for it. Like they just cannot deal with like another major project taking up their time because they're trying to make a product and sell product and do their actual business rather than the pesky website, right? So so that's the way we've kind of worked by, I would call it, I guess, reverse engineering, where we are saying, okay, well, we have all these dependencies, how can we reduce the app stack and eliminate stuff that's just, an app that injects, I don't know, a button. It's like that should just be hard coded. Okay, one down. Or, this reviews tool is really terrible and is creating all these weird JS errors. Let's migrate that. Okay, one down. And then, maintaining those styling as you're bringing new stuff in, and then looking at, what are your slider libraries? What are the various things that you've installed? What are all the dependencies? What does your theme.js look like? Where are those errors coming from? One of our first major kind of inside-out retheme projects, we had a product selector PDP for apparel. So there's a lot of different sizing, a lot of different configuration, right? Pushing well beyond 100 variant limit per product. So you have Ajax for every single element, basically, et cetera. And, again, one of those things where it's like every 17th click or something, it seemed like the selector would just forget what you clicked on and just wipe it out. And you'd have to reselect everything again. You're like, what's going on? Audited, I think, 800 lines of theme.js to find that there was one end of one line that was a semicolon instead of a comma. And that's what did it. And I think it took, 15 hours of trying, 50 different things. And in the end, it was something like that, right? So then you're like, okay, let's, at some point, phase one is fix the product selector. Phase two is to ditch this product selector and do this differently. Phase three is to actually then, eventually redo the UX of that selector, which will then have a V2 of our phase two, and sort of iteratively, you're essentially rebuilding, but functionally, you're not just throwing out the theme every time. You're really going to have like, PDP specific JS. You're going to consolidate libraries. You're going to try to reduce conflicts and add features and so on and so forth. And in the end, you look at it and you're like, we might have worked on that theme for 6 years, right, in total. And it still functions and it still sells every day. And the company has doubled several times over since then. And they haven't replatformed, they haven't rethemed. But in essence, we've kind of like, essentially been through many versions, and we actually, version as we're building. But and that could make it actually really crafty and really terrible. But if the goal is actual efficiency, then I think that sort of the opposite happens.
Yeah. It's kind of like, what's that thought exercise? Is it like Ship of Theseus or something like that, where if you slowly replace the entire thing, is it still the original thing by the time you're done?
Right. Yeah, which is a good question. I think often is not.
Well, you mentioned JavaScript there just a second ago, and I tip my hand. I'm not a huge JavaScript fan. I prefer some other languages, but it is certainly widely used and widely used to good effect. What are some of the techniques and the things that you run into in terms of dealing with technical debt within JavaScript? Because it's so flexible. I imagine you come across quite a variability in terms of how people implement it.
Yeah, it's certainly easy to get carried away with it. I have found actually the most problems, I would say, from apps injecting their own JavaScript, irrespective of anything going on the site itself. we've had some like fairly catastrophic problems of apps that like don't detect jQuery, and they're like, here's another version that's different of jQuery, and you're like, oh, the entire site's broken. Why is this? Oh, it's because you just installed this app, right? And of course, we try to vet apps, but sometimes folks go off on their own, do stuff, and as they should. But and we try to maintain dev environments and say, hey, install on dev first or whatever. But sometimes those problems don't crop up till later. The worst, I think, is we had a app that installed their own version of Alpine.js, which syntactically like uses the $ that jQuery uses, but then outputs not jQuery, and so all of the jQuery on the site was trying to parse itself through Alpine instead, and just every single thing on the site was broken. I'm like, great. Well, I don't want to always use jQuery, but honestly, sometimes there's use cases, or again, we inherited something, and it's like, oh, you want me to, you want to pay me to redo all of jQuery on the site, and to what end? Oh, it'll look and function exact same, but it's just better. Trust me, it's like that doesn't always fly, right? So there's things like that happen. I think that there's a lot, but on the other hand, there's a lot that just really kind of has to be done with Shopify with JavaScript. We do a lot of AJAX refreshing. We do a lot of product manipulation that really kind of is contingent on user inputs, and that's really seems to be, at least for the moment, the best way to do that. And I think it's something that I was told very early on by a hardware engineer, there's no such thing as a temporary fix. And even in software, it's like, if you think I'm just going to do this real quick with jQuery or JavaScript or whatever, just to get this thing working, and then you look at it 3 years later, and you're like, why is this like this? And like, who did that? It's like really keeping that in mind for something that is as flexible as JavaScript. Like, doesn't mean we should just knock out things that quickly do it. We should really, take the time to output that correctly in a different way, and so forth. But
This is a fascinating topic to keep talking about, but I think at some point here we need to transition to the changelog. But Taylor, is there anything you want to toss in here before I redirect this?
No, I think maybe the big thing that I'd ask here, which Carl, I saw your little subtitle update, and I corrected it there to my name, so thanks there. But so for me, like when you're talking about like trying to find like errors in JS, and you're either inheriting a file, or maybe you're working just like with an older version of a theme and you're trying to hack through some stuff or whatever. So I've found AI is like actually pretty helpful for some of that stuff, to call out like these big giant files quickly. But I don't know if you also have any tips for people for calling out like library conflicts like that. Stuff like, obviously, I think probably the most common one that we all have run into a lot is like every single app trying to load their own version of jQuery and breaking everything. So app devs, quit it, like knock it off. But like, I don't know if you have any other tips for some that are a little bit more nuanced than that. I haven't actually seen the Alpine in jQuery conflict before, so that one was like, okay, like now I've just like mentally clocked like a new thing to add to my checks. But
yeah,
I don't know if you have any tips for like how y'all suss that out, particularly with apps and theme conflicts. Because other than uninstalling them or blocking their JS one by one, it's not super simple.
Yeah, it's something that we've gotten more attuned to also in like doing site speed optimization, where you're really looking at every line of rendered front end code for performance, and where is that being injected, and like what is that file, and where does that come from. I haven't used AI to do that. I think that's an interesting idea to help assess, and that actually might just go try that out. But for me, I would say one of the things we've learned kind of the hard way is that in Shopify, you can't one-to-one sync a dev store with a production store. You have to have a separate environment, then you have to push pull stuff between. You never actually have a mirrored environment like you could in other stacks. for us, even if the client will incur, paying for the app twice, essentially, we really encourage everyone and try to get everyone to install all the apps from prod on dev, because we've also seen stuff where it's like, well, we have the most important ones, or we have 80% of them, but there's some stuff on prod that's not on dev, and then that's sometimes when you get into that issue. And then we've been pretty actually successful in negotiating, sometimes one-on-one with app companies, being like, hey, we have this dev store, it's at a separate URL, but it's password protected, you can look at it, like, can you waive the fee, for us to install on this? And they'll make an exception or something like that, because it's like you don't want to pay $100 a month on 2 stores and essentially only use one. So that's something I would encourage folks to do. Yeah, looking at some like SSO tools and things that are really parsing JavaScript for speed, you end up also figuring out like, oh, okay, there's this and this library actually has that also, and is there a way to consolidate that, or is there a way to say, hey, app dev, can you make this optional, or is there a way to escape this, etc. And we've also done the similar thing for accessibility. Hey, you're injecting this thing without a label that's not accessible. If you improve this, it'll help everyone. And actually trying to just directly work with app companies to kind of essentially improve their product, but speaking from a sort of back-end dev perspective, where it's like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. I know what I'm talking about. This is a random customer service thing. Hey, can we kind of collaborate on this? Has been pretty fruitful, not always successful. But
That's amazing. It's really cool, Paulo, to hear about the depth of experience that you and your agency have, and also the care that you exhibit for your clients and the users in terms of being willing to even go that far. I know a lot of people probably just sweep that under the rug and not even worry about it, but that's kudos to you. Like I said, I think we could talk all day, but I know you live in paradise and probably want to get outside and go surfing or something here shortly. So, Taylor, before I go and shovel off my sidewalk, do you want to talk about? It actually didn't snow yet, but this coming week it will. Do you want to talk about the changelog?
Yeah. Let's talk about the changelog. We hit a lot of them in the last time, so it's a little light
Nothing's
this week.
changed.
So, no, I mean, there were a couple. There were a couple, just couple light things. There was one update for removing unnecessary relevance sort options. I thought that was interesting, just because I don't know, does anybody even use that? And I think that was kind of the consensus of why they're getting rid of it. Like, eliminate cases where the option was offered for no unique behavior previously acted as a basic ID sort. So just, I guess there's not enough reason to keep it around, so they're getting rid of it. So, if that's going to impact you, hopefully it doesn't. I did think this is really helpful. There's a new events and origins and store credit account transactions that's just dropped, so we'll link that up as well. But with the January 2025 admin API versions, so there's this helpful new type introduced for store credit account transaction origins, which I think is really, really useful, because, and I've had this happen where we were trying to figure out on one shop where a gift card originated from that was created, because gift cards work kind of like discount codes, right? And we were like, where is this coming from? Like, someone was able to get a whole free order and shipping. I think it was to Hawaii, but it was stateside, and so it was this big, massive order where it gave them free 2-day shipping. So it was like $80 or something like this, or whatever, that they got for free and shouldn't have. So it took some tracking. So I could see this being very helpful too for if you need access to that, the origin of where the store credit was created. I could see that being very helpful there as well. And that's with all the new fun store credit stuff that can just be issued directly and stuff here. And then one that just dropped today, like literally today. I haven't seen it actually drop out. I checked the scheduled tab, but it says February 7th, and that's when we're recording today. But you've got this attribute marketing consent to retail locations. I'm not really sure about the benefit of that, but I mean, it's in here, and I only had 3, so we're gonna list it, as well. So if you need to track marketing opt-in rates by retail location, maybe Paolo's got some good ideas here. He's more of a marketing insights guy. To provide better visibility into how customer marketing opt-ins are captured, you're gonna have access to this now. So that is there, and that's the whole changelog. Yeah, pretty light today.
Yeah, I assume that's probably for compliance more than anything.
That makes sense.
Getting a essentially something like a GDPR or CCPA complaint saying like, I didn't sign up for this. And you're like, well, when you're in store on,
You did.
2725 at this location, you did actually in person do this. I would imagine more than it's useful as a marketing metric, but you never know.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Well, thank you for clearing that up because I was like, I have no idea why this would be helpful.
Amazing. All right, well, we are down to the favorite part. Well, Taylor's favorite part of the show, the pick of the week, where we take a moment to share something that we found interesting. Could be something mundane, like, I don't know, an automobile, vehicular, washing.
Trying to say it nice, like he was okay. For those of you who've made it this far, he was trash talking before this started. My pick, of the car wash, the subscription service. So everybody write in and comment and tell Karl he's wrong.
Yeah, the
car wash
R1
subscription
listener,
service
let me
is
know.
awesome.
All right, Taylor, do you want to share yours first? So I have
Whoa,
time to
I
think
get to
about
go
a
first
retort.
right after the changelog. Okay,
I know.
Okay, let's do this.
Spicing it up.
Okay, mine is wall clipper trimmers. So, and this is also something we can get into it. Paolo here was actually like fighting me a little bit on this because apparently he has not had the quality experience I had. I paid like $25 when I was like a freshman in college because I was like, I'm not paying for haircuts, and I learned how to cut my hair, and so I've cut my hair since college. So whether or not like my abilities are that great, like let's not dig into that necessarily. But these clipper trimmers, that's like the best $25 I've spent. So like the past like whatever it is 10-15 years, because I'm getting super old now, whatever, that I've had these clippers. They've held up great, and I don't have to anymore because I'm getting older, but I was cutting my hair like every other week. So like they've got use, and now I'm cutting my kids' hair even with it too. So not my daughter's. That would not go over well. I can literally only do this one haircut. This is it. This is it. So this is what he gets. But yeah, mine have held up great. So wall clippers and trimmers. I'm sorry, Paolo has not had the same
No.
the same quality experience that I have. So
I think
maybe you just got a
mine
bad run.
$80 on Amazon 2 years
Well,
ago and just completely exploded.
First of all, let's talk about that for a second. You bought
They did
the
say made in
Amazon
USA,
version.
but
You
maybe they're
bought-
not real. I don't know.
I say you bought the Amazon version. I've talked to multiple people about how this is like the Amazon gets the crappier version that gets sent out. So I bought it from Walmart. I don't know if that was any better. Like that would have been the Amazon at the time. So that was before Amazon was selling. It was just books then. So
Don't make them like they used to. That's, I think,
no. That's probably what it was. So that's my pick. That's my pick.
Thanks,
That's $25 I've spent.
That's right. It's good to get a deal. Follow, do you want to share yours?
Sure. I just found out about this service, which I honestly wish I'd known about a long time ago. And I haven't been able to use it yet because I'm already signed up for so many things. But, as an agency, we have a lot of SaaS subscriptions. We have a lot of licenses of things. And because I'm cheap, I was Googling around for a coupon to a SaaS program I was about to sign up for, and I found about something called Nacho Nacho. And nachonacho.com is like a rewards program for SaaS. So if you haven't yet signed up for a trial or like otherwise made an account with the platform, but you're pretty sure you're going to sign up or whatever, they give you like a virtual credit card, and if you sign up and spend using that, you get up to like 25% cash back on SaaS, like sometimes for a year, whatever, or 3 months, sometimes for perpetuity. But I haven't found anything like it that actually gives you, more than like just a standard credit card points, for spending the money on a certain card. So I think it's a really interesting concept. It is monetized in, various tiers from free on up. But I think potentially is one of the things where I was like, oh, actually the savings from this is far exceeds, the cost of the service. And I just think it's a really interesting concept too. So
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Heard
Thank
that
you.
before. Cool.
yeah.
Reminds me of the old joke. Taylor, do you know what you call somebody else's cheese?
What, Karl?
Nacho cheese.
Ah,
Anyway.
classic.
Yes. Now I want Mexican for lunch. Thanks for that, Paulo.
Correct.
My pick of the week is a note-taking tool called LogSec. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And, there's a bunch of them out there, Obsidian, Notion, whatever. I found a video where someone was using it for something, being very descriptive. I can't remember what. But I started looking at it like, oh, this is really cool. Because I've been trying to use Google Docs for all my notes because I have a hard time retaining context with all the different things I do. And you could like, oh, it's just one doc. I can search it. It's easy. But I hate it. I hate the experience. It's not intuitive. I don't like logging into my Google account to have to do that, leaving a tab open. Logsec, it's open source. It's super nice. It uses Graph and Outline is like the primary data models. And they do all kinds of cool things with it. So you know how it is in our circles. You switch note-taking programs every once in a while because that's just what we do. But if you're looking for a new one, give it a shot. See what you think.
Nice. Haven't seen this one.
Yeah. All right. And with that, I think we'll wrap this episode to bring it to a close. Thank you, Paulo, so much for getting up early and meeting with us. Right. Taylor, thanks for being here as always. And for those of you that are still listening, Prakar, thanks again for being with us here today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, Paolo.
Thanks so much. Take care, guys.